Hello everyone, and this is my presentation on forensic genetic genealogy. So this presentation will go over the introduction, key issues and terms regarding forensic genetic genealogy, the influential theories related to forensic genetic genealogy, the methodologies used when researching it, the ethical concerns with using forensic genetic genealogy, and it will end with a conclusion. So first, the introduction. Forensic genetic genealogy has enabled law enforcement to solve cold cases, even when they are decades old. It uses DNA evidence in combination with emerging genetic technology and research in order to solve cold cases where all other leads have been exhausted. For example, many of you have probably heard of the Golden State Killer, who was caught using forensic genetic genealogy over 40 years after his crimes began. More recently, forensic genetic genealogy was actually used to connect Brian Kohberger to the November 2022 murders of 4 students from the University of Idaho. Right, so moving on to the key issues and terms. It is a relatively new technique. Like I said, it combines traditional DNA testing and the genealogical research. There are limitations to which databases allow law enforcement use, which at the time of Kling et al.'s research were GEDmatch Pro, Family Tree DNA, and DNA Solves. It's typically used in violent crimes or in cases of unidentified victims, but there is currently no definite data on when or how often it's used. And it's estimated that around 500 cases have been assisted from the use of FGG. So, to look at DNA evolution, the forensic DNA usage began in 1986 in the UK, when law enforcement asked Dr. Alec Jeffries to confirm a confession in 2 rapes and murders. There were 3 early U.S. court cases which helped establish the DNA use in the criminal justice system. So first there was Tommy Lee Andrews, who was convicted of a rape in 1987 when his DNA matched crime scene evidence. In contrast, Glenn Dale Woodall was actually exonerated using DNA evidence in 1992 in West Virginia. And in 1994, Timothy Wilson Spencer was convicted and sentenced to death based on DNA evidence that was presented in his case. Despite this, there were some challenges to DNA evidence being admitted in court. For example, in 1989, the New York Supreme Court challenged forensic DNA use as evidence in the case of Jose Castro, and this led to the court developing guidelines to regulate testing procedures, lab maintenance of results and reports, and the inclusion of probability calculations as well as explanations of potential errors. So, thinking of forensic genetic genealogy and true crime, it has assisted in developing the use of FGG. There are television shows like Cold Case Files, DNA Speaks, and podcasts like Faded Evidence, which examine true crime cases that were solved through the use of FGG. There are some differences between FGG and traditional DNA analysis. And those are the types of databases that are used, the kind of DNA marker that is analyzed, the type of technology used for the technique, and the file format of data that is developed in the technique. Despite all these positives, there are some concerns with using FGG. For example, there is currently no federal legislation concerning the use of forensic genetic genealogy, and some researchers, like you'll see later, Scudder et al. And Syndercombe Court, consider its use as a potential violation of the Fourth Amendment right to freedom and privacy against unreasonable search and seizures. And there are also some significant costs and time associated with forensic genetic genealogy use, which can vary pretty wildly depending on the case. This just goes over a few cases that were solved using forensic genetic genealogy. The first one, Golden State Killer case, this goes over the perpetrator himself, who was arrested in 2018. There were so many victims, it's just easier to look at the perpetrator himself. And then there's Nicole Smith, Subir Chatterjee, and Mary Scott, who were all victims with their perpetrators identified at the bottom. Alright, so moving on to the influential theories. Related to FGG, there are rational choice theory and the MAOA theory. So, rational choice theory basically states that the individual will logically consider rewards and punishments of actions prior to committing an act. The main theorists in this are Ronald Clark and Derek Cornish, Akers and Sellers, Cesare Bessaria, and Jeremy Bentham. And rationality, as deformed by Verbora, basically says the role of reasoning in human behavior, and it views crime as the outcome of an individual thinking through the possible rewards and downsides of a criminal act. Another key term is free will, which is essentially the discretion to choose one's own actions. The strengths involved with rational choice theory are that there is a long and developed connection between multiple theorists, and it also denies the false idea of the cycle of violence. On the other hand, there are some limitations, which are that there are debates surrounding how rational any individual truly is, especially a criminal, and it cannot be generalized to multiple types of crime at once. And finally, it also neglects to consider outside factors in criminal behavior. So the MAOA, or monoamine oxidase, which is also called the warrior gene, fun fact, MAOA is an enzyme genetically coded to metabolize neurotransmitters in the brain, and the theory shows that low MAOA levels have been associated with higher levels of dopamine and norepinephrine, which leads to antisocial behaviors, low self-control, and intensified aggression. So Hans Brunner was the one that discovered the relationship between MAOA and antisocial behaviors. Some strengths to this theory are that it provides a potential genetic basis for aggression and or violence, and it shows a clear connection between the genetics and the role of environment on behaviors. It also provides a potential for preventative measures in individuals that have low MAOA levels, so potentially preventing future crime or other criminal behavior. But there are some limitations to this theory, which are that there are potential racial implications. For example, certain races or ethnicities, such as the Maori people in New Zealand, have been found to have low levels of MAOA generally. And this just goes to show that it cannot definitively detect or predict future violent or criminal behavior. And there are also some ethical concerns of improper labeling of individuals based on their MAOA levels. Next, I'll go over two of the methodologies used in the research of FGG, which are content analysis and case studies. So, content analysis can be traced to the basis of mass communication in the 1950s with newspapers, according to Wilson. And it can be defined as a research technique for making replicable and valid inferences from texts or other meaningful matter to the context of their use. So any form of content serves as the data source for content analysis, whether it be texts, images, anything really. And there are several applications across various fields for content analysis. So some of its strengths are that it's highly flexible and allows for both empirically and theoretically driven research. The process of performing content analysis is discrete and unobtrusive, and content analysis is particularly helpful when describing communications. On the other hand, the use of content analysis is highly subjective because researchers code the work into their own categories, and each researcher may code something differently. And it can also take a significant amount of time to perform depending on how much content there is to analyze. The second one is case study, which is used to analyze a specific case to try and fully understand the situation and generate more general ideas about regularities found within the observations. It's defined as a naturalistic methodology, and in the research, Crow et al. Outlines 5 main parts to conduct a case study, which are defining the case, choosing the case or cases, accumulating and examining data, deciphering the data, and reporting the conclusions. In this topic of FGG, Wickenheiser examines the case of Joseph James DeAngelo, who was the Golden State Killer. Strengths of using case studies are that it is very flexible. The data and analysis are primarily chosen based on the topic or research field, and it's particularly helpful when trying to answer questions like why, how, or what. The limitations include that it doesn't address generalizability and lacks scientific rigor and reliability, so it obviously can't be considered fully reliable because it's not possible to repeat research under constant or consistent conditions, and analyzing a specific case is also highly subjective. Moving on to the ethical concerns, law enforcement officers face ethical dilemmas regarding forensic genetic genealogy in multiple ways. To look at this, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, or IACP, has established a code of ethics for law enforcement, which will be used to identify a ethical dilemma and how it could go either way. An ethical dilemma is defined as a circumstance in which there are two or more choices that conflict with each other. And like I mentioned earlier, Scudder et al. 2019 and Sindercombe Court 2018 suggest law enforcement use of genetic databases to solve crimes as a potential violation of privacy in regards to the Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable searches and the rights to privacy and freedom. So obviously, like I said earlier, using FGG means that law enforcement searches genetic databases in order to identify individuals potentially related to the person who deposited DNA evidence in a crime. And again, Scudder et al. And Sindercombe Court specifically state that it's a potential violation of Fourth Amendment rights. So in the IACP, Code of Ethics, which I will show you on the next slide, there's a section that states, "I will uphold the Constitution and honor the rights of all to life, liberty, equality, and justice." There's also a part of the Code of Ethics that states, "As a sworn officer, my fundamental duty is to serve the community by safeguarding lives and property against threats that could take advantage of or harm members of my community or otherwise impact peace and order." So, in the terms of FGG, while law enforcement might consider the use of these databases as a necessity to solve crimes and protect their community, it could also be seen as a violation of constitutional rights, which would obviously therefore go against the Code of Ethics. So this slide just shows you the entirety of the IACP Code of Ethics, which I won't take the time to read fully to you, but you can find it online if you're interested. And moving on to the conclusion, so again, forensic genetic genealogy is the combination of traditional forensic DNA analysis and the genetic genealogy research which develops family trees and lineage. It has allowed investigators to solve decades-long cold cases to bring closure to the victims' families, as well as help solve current crimes like that of the murders of the 4 Idaho University students. To leave you with one final thought of this, I want you to consider whether or not you would approve of using forensic genetic genealogy to solve a crime that involved a close friend or family member of yours, or if you would prefer law enforcement to stick with more traditional investigative methods. And then here are just my references, which again I will not take the time to read out loud.